Ho, ho, ho. Christmas. Christmas. That time of the year where you can celebrate all of your materialistic wants and needs while also spending time with family. Yet here you are, spending that time watching a weirdo on the internet talk about fetishes and kinks. Hello and welcome back. My name is Eros, and we return for part 3 of the Great Fetish Iceberg series. I'd just like to start off this video by saying Merry Christmas and thank you all for 100 subscribers. It really means a lot to me. So to celebrate the milestone, as well as give you guys a bit of a fun little Christmas present, I've decided to instead cover 3 tiers instead of my usual 2. Today we'll be talking about tiers 5 through 7 of the Great Fetish Iceberg. If you haven't done it already, please check out parts 1 and 2 of this series. I guess without further ado, let's just stop talking and get into it. So tier 5 of this iceberg is referred to as Degenerates, which is, it's only going to get worse from here. I keep saying it, but this video is where it is the most fucked up. So get ready. Section 1 I labeled as Incest. If you recall from the last video, I did mention that step-sibling incest shows up in the tier prior. Well, this is where full-on, blood-related Alabama incest lies on this iceberg. First off, we have father-daughter, mother-son. I don't really think I need to go any more in depth in explaining what this is. It speaks for itself. So does sibling incest and just other family members as a whole. Incest is incest. You can do it with an uncle, a grandpa, a niece, nephew, or aunt. Next up, we have section 2, which is titled Torture. These are all the ways someone can torture themselves and still get some kind of sexual thrill out of it. So first off, we have the snuff film. This one's a bit of a myth on the internet where there are movies that just, they have a real murder in them, or their intention is to just record an actual murder and turn it into a film. Next up, we have CBT, which is cock and ball torture. These are all the ways that you can torture someone sexually involving the penis, and you can still get some kind of sexual thrill out of it. Next up is cock impalement, which is a form of cock and ball torture. Next up is dick mutilation, which is just another word for cock and ball torture. Next up we have breast ironing. You lay someone's breasts out on a table, you iron them with a clothing iron, or maybe a straightening iron. I don't really know. Obviously, I don't have the boobs to do it. Next up, we have tooth extraction, which, for someone with very sensitive teeth, was a very painful thing to imagine. Next up, we have ball busting. It is just another variation of cock and ball torture. And then lastly, we have castration, where you just cut someone's dick and balls off. As an honorable mention, I'd like to add the BME Pain Olympics. One of the most infamous videos to come from the BME Pain Olympics was the video of a man chopping up his penis. That being said, the penis was revealed to be fake. It was just a hot dog. Next up, we have section 3, which I just titled the Unclassifieds. These don't belong in any kind of section, and they are also very vague general terms, or just stuff that I really don't have knowledge of. The first example of not knowing what the fuck I'm talking about, we have reproductive endosymbiosis. Endosymbiosis is where a parasite or some kind of symbiotic organism lives within something. Endo. I don't really understand how this is like some kind of kink or fetish unless it's some kind of obscure furry porn that I don't know about. I guess someone could be turned on by just living inside of someone and then reproducing in them. Next up, we have the male pregnancy. This one, I don't even think I need to explain this. This one kind of speaks for itself. Next up on this iceberg is the real Christian Pope, which I guess would tie back to Irredeemable, unless somewhere out there was some kind of pope that did something very sexual or something. I'm not exactly sure. This is like where things start to be like, I don't understand what they mean and what they have to do with this iceberg. Next up, we have elastic body and limbs. This could be a hentai thing where it's just, of course, if you have the power to extend your limbs, you could extend your fingers, or your boobs, or your dick, or just any body part that would be sexy, even feet. Next up, we have Zoophilia. It's where you're turned on by hurricanes and tornadoes. Personally myself, I am very turned on by the Sharknado. Next up is dragons fucking cars, which is a really weird internet phenomenon where people just draw dragons fucking cars. This one has a lot more presence on the internet than it probably should, but it's funny as fuck to look at. Next up is Dendrophilia. It's where you have a fetish for trees. You're turned on by a tree. Next up is the live burial. Live burial, it speaks for itself. You're being buried alive and it's turning you on. Next up is melting. It's a weird art-based fetish where you just draw a character being melted and that turns you on. Next up is the forced orgasm. It's where someone forces their partner to orgasm in a way that's out of their control. That being said, it's usually consensual. Next up is parasites. You're just turned on by a parasite living in you or something. Next up is petrification. It's where you're turned on by someone turning into a statue, or you're turned on by you being turned into a statue. This one, if you think this is weird, then this is like just the beginning. Next up is anorexia. This is the sexualization of someone with anorexia. I guess the thrill comes from watching someone's body deteriorate as awfully as it does with something like anorexia. And then the antithesis of someone who sexualizes an anorexic is what's referred to as a feeder. A feeder is someone who force feeds their partner constantly a bunch of food in order to fatten them up and then ruin their partner's health and overall life expectancy. After that, we have drugs, which could go into a lot of directions. Hopefully it isn't someone being drugged or you being drugged. I don't really have an explanation for this one. Next up, we have cancer. If this is anything like the anorexia explanation, it's probably when you're turned on by the deterioration of the human body through something as awful as cancer. Next up, we have the tulpas. A tulpa is the idea that if you manifest something hard enough, it exists in a physical reality. And I guess there are some people out there that have sex with their tulpas, which I can't even imagine what these people would be thinking when they're talking about this shit. Next up is explosives. This could be referring to pyrophilia, where you're turned on by the thrill of like lighting fires and shit. There's a lot of things that this iceberg creator uses that he's actually referring to something else, because the thing I searched up from his iceberg doesn't show up at all on the internet, and it could be interpreted as something else. Next up is gunplay. It's a step up from knife play, but it's still the idea that like you're turned on by the thrill of not knowing what your partner is going to do with that gun, or the physical stimulation of them just rubbing the gun on you. I really gotta stop doing this. Next up are aeromorphs. They are anthropomorphized planes. And then an offshoot of that would be mechanophilia, which is where you're turned on by cars and other machinery. Next is symphorophilia, where you're turned on by planning a disaster like a car accident or something. It really makes 9/11 weird to think about in this context. Next up, we have milking. It's where you're turned on by milking your male partner of their manly juices. Following that, we have the comically large penis. What I'm actually referring to is just a man that is very much blessed by God. Following that, we have cum sharking, where you just find someone on the street to come on in some kind of weird sex game. And then next up is bug chasing, where you're turned on by trying to catch a disease such as HIV. I'm pretty sure it's solely HIV. Either way, I think bug chasing could apply to a lot of other STDs. Next up is egg laying, where it kind of ties back with the tentacle monsters, where they'll lay eggs in you and people are turned on by you laying that egg. After that is transformation. I guess someone's turned on by someone transforming into something else. Next up, we have oniholification. For some reason, the person who created this iceberg decided to put this on here, even though it has no actual existence on the internet. But there is a trope in hentai where someone turns into a sex toy, I guess, or it could tie back to the curse hentais where it's a voodoo sex doll and you fuck it and the voodoo victim feels the fucking. And then to finish off this section, we have limb swapping. You swap limbs with someone. That speaks for itself. And then the last section, section 4, I titled as speechless, because I really have no words for the things I'm going to be describing in this section. First off is the Brundle penis. This refers to a scene from The Fly, If you don't recall what the movie The Fly is about, essentially Jeff Goldblum merges his DNA with a fly, and his body starts slowly morphing into a fly-human hybrid. At some point before the transformation, but after the DNA fusion, this character has sex with his love interest, and at some point later on during the movie, that woman gives birth to a very penis-shaped fly-human hybrid monster. Shitting dick nipples is another weird internet phenomena where someone's nipples are replaced with dicks, and then there is shit coming out of them. This one's another one that I don't understand why it became something that reoccurs a lot on the internet, but it does, and now I know that it exists. Next is the wear diaper. It is a very infamous, I guess it was a 4chan post or something? It was a subreddit. It was a subreddit called Wear Diapers, and the only post on it was this comic strip of the main character transforming into a diaper on the full moon. It's one of the stupidest things that I've seen on the internet, and probably one of the funniest things I've ever talked about in this video series. Next up is children's toys and age regression. This is one of the few instances where I'm kind of frustrated at the inclusion of things on this iceberg, because as I mentioned earlier, age play and age regression are two completely different things. Age play is not regression. Regression is a response to trauma. Age play is kind of the weird fetishization of that. Regression is a coping mechanism. Age play is purely sexual. Children's toys goes back to the age regression. Some people could find comfort in things like stuffed animals or just in general other children's toys to just deal with that stuff. Next up is pisturbation, where you're pissing while you're jerking off. I don't really know how else to explain that to you. After that, we have nipple penetration. Do I even really need to go any more deeper into this one? Next up is clopping. If you don't remember from the last tier or so, I mentioned that furry porn exists, and it also happens to the TV show My Little Pony Friendship is Magic. That show has a heavily male audience referred to as bronies, and of course, sexualization ensues, and we have what's called clop or clopping. If a pony is somehow touching themselves, instead of a fapping noise, it would be clopping. Next up, we have nose fucking. It's another hole that should not be at all explored. After that, we have burn victims. It's where you're sexualizing a burn victim. That's all there is to it. Next up, we have coprophagia, where you're turned on by eating human shit. Next up is oculolinctus, where you're licking your partner's eye. Of course, even though I should have put this after coprophagia, we have scat, where you're turned on by shit, or just shit at all in some kind of sexual setting. And then we have the ear fuck, another hole that a dick does not belong in. Following that, we have hard vor. I did mention vor in the last tier. I horribly described it. Vor itself is where you're eating someone, but the thing is, normal vor, you're eating that person in one piece. Hard vor is where you're cutting that person up and eating them. Next up is the colonoscopy, where you're turned on by, I guess, having a colonoscopy. I don't exactly see how you'd be turned on by looking into someone having a colonoscopy. Next up, we have diaper messing. If you recall the adult baby and diaper lovers, well, the adult baby uses that diaper sometimes, and diaper messing happens. And then so does coprophagia. Next up, we have cock vor. It's something that doesn't belong in a penis. It's where you bore someone whole using your penis. This one shows up a lot in furry art too. Next up, we have internal urination. You just pee in someone instead of coming in them. Following that, we have nipple vor. If it's anything like cock vor, someone is vored in the nipples. Next up, we have the COVID test. If you're unfamiliar, the COVID test requires that you stick a swab up your nose, and that's the sample you get in order to test if you have COVID. I guess there's people out in the world that are very much turned on by that. And then to finish off this section in tier 5 as a whole, we have slavery. Slavery also could be the S in BDSM. It's where you're just the slave to your submissive. It's another degrading term to call the submissive in the relationship. Slavery could also be fetishizing slavery, the American slavery, where we have Django without Django saving the black people. Now that we're done with tier 5, we can finally move on to tier 6. Let's get into it. So, tier 6 is titled Redeemable, or Irredeemable. Holy fuck. That's all I really have to say about it. Let's get into section 1. Section 1 is the unclassifieds of this tier, because these things didn't belong with what you're about to see in section 2. First off is Charisma Jati. He is an Indonesian comic artist, and the thing is, his comics are very pornographic, and they also feature some kind of very violent gore. He is just some form of weird edgelord porn artist that probably jerks off to his own art. There is not a lot of information on this guy. Next up is Hard Knife Play. If you recall from the last video, I mentioned knife play as you're turned on by your partner having a knife and not knowing what they're going to do with it. Usually in normal knife play, someone rubs the knife on you and you're just turned on by that kind of stimulation. Hard knife play is where they're actually starting to cut into you and such. It is a tier above just basic normal knife play. After that, we have the donkey punch. It's where you punch someone in the spine or the back of the head in the middle of anal, and then they contract around you, and that is supposed to make things feel better, I guess. Next up is Trypophilia. If you remember trypophobia, it's the stupid internet fear where you're scared of clustered holes or cracks. Of course, if it's aphilia, it's where you're turned on by a cluster of holes or cracks in the ground. Next up is the acid throw. Acid throw is where it was a phenomenon that happened in the UK where people would just throw acid in people's faces. I guess those people will be turned on by the thrill of throwing acid in someone's face, but I can't really say for certain. Next up is zombies. I really contemplated putting this one here, but I guess it is normal enough to be unclassified. You're just turned on by zombies. You know, Walking Dead, Night of the Living Dead zombies, the cootie zombies. After that is the Cenobites. There's a lot of stuff, once again, that I don't understand why the person put this on here, but I guess since the Cenobites have to do with sex, they felt the need to be included. Cenobites, if you don't recall from the movie Hellraiser, one of my favorite horror films of all time, the Cenobites they're not demons per se. They're supernatural creatures. They're neither good nor evil. Their job is just to spread pleasure and pain around to the world. And they essentially make pleasure and pain one and the same. Once again, highly recommend watching the film Hellraiser. First off, love the Cenobite designs, but I love Clive Barker as a whole. Next up, we have casting Poto Goddess. I have no idea what the hell this one is. There's no such thing as a Poto Goddess, and I don't understand why it's on here. This was one of the few entries that frustrated me when doing this iceberg video. Next up, we have skeletons. You're turned on by skeletons. Spooky, scary skeletons. Next up is Teratophilia. You're turned on by a monster. And then what kind of, for some reason, gets tied to it is Dysmorphophilia, where you're turned on by someone with a physical deformity or of some sort. Next up is the lung cancer fetish, which I guess means that it was somehow worse than the normal cancer fetish. I think it's just referring to the fact that lung cancer is the most prominent cancer to be sexualized by the internet. After that, we have catfisting. This is another one that I didn't understand what it does with fetishes or kinks. Catfisting is where you're in a catfish like mud hole. You put your fist in the mud hole and then you pull out a catfish. That's a way of catfishing or fishing for a catfish. I guess it could be like you're digging your fist into someone's ass and fishing for shit or something. Or I guess if you're, instead of using your hand to hunt for catfish, you use your dick to get them to latch on. I don't really understand why this one's on here either. Next up is foot binding. Foot binding is a practice where women, usually women, will mutilate their feet in order to fulfill some kind of weird beauty standard. You see this specifically with, there's a specific shoe where it's like Imagine this is your foot. Your toes would be going like this if you wear the shoe long enough. I forget. I think it's a Chinese culture. I'm pretty sure. I just forget what the practice itself would be called there. Following that, we have serial killer Wikipedia articles. I think this one explains itself pretty well. There are people out in the world who fetishize serial killers and the horrible atrocities they've all committed. It got really bad with serial killers like Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer got treated like a superhero, and Ted Bundy, a serial killer who did horrible things to a lot of women, is sexualized because he was conventionally attractive for the time. As a gay man, I don't understand the appeal. Next up is live plastination. This is another thing that is on the iceberg, even though it doesn't exist. Plastination is where you're preserving body parts in like near perfect condition, but I guess there's a live variation of it where you go through that process and you're living mummification, I guess. I don't really understand, nor was I able to find anything about this. After that, we have reptilian overlords, another thing that has no elaboration on it. I guess you're turned on by reptilian-based humanoid monster things, even though monsters is already a thing on this iceberg that shows up in the last tier. After that is insect sex. You're turned on by insects fucking. And then an offshoot of that is formicophilia. You're turned on by being eaten alive by bugs and insects. That's all I have for this section. Now we move on to section 2, I titled as Acts Against God, and you are going to find out why. First off, we have the self-suck. It's where, by some weird miracle, you can suck your own dick. Sometimes you will have to take out a rib or two just to make the process more accessible. As the great Moist Critical once said, there are two people in this world. There are people who've tried to suck their own dick, and liars. And I've never tried to suck my own dick. After that, we have cannibalism. Big jump. It's where you're just eating a person alive. An honorable mention I'd like to actually add here is the Cannibal Cafe. If you don't recall what the Cannibal Cafe is, there was a man named Irvin Mivis. He was looking for someone to eat on the website called Cannibal Cafe. One day, someone got into his inbox who was into being eaten alive. And eventually, these two people would meet up in person. Mivis would then proceed to record him cutting up his partner and eating him. That being said, he did have the human decency to actually put him to sleep so that he wasn't suffering through the torture process, I guess. This murder was really talked about a lot at the time because this dude murdered somebody and ate him, but the guy that got aided and murdered consented to it. This is something I'd honestly like to cover in a video on its own. I am kind of fascinated by like the idea of consensual murder, I guess, and just like how that process went about. An offshoot of cannibalism, I guess, would be the roasting princess. It's probably someone who is the person being eaten alive in the cannibalism conversation. They're probably being cooked alive too, given the roasting in roasting princesses. Next up, we have the miscarriage. It's where someone sexualizes a very tragic thing that could happen to any mother out there. After that, we have suicide. There are people out in the world, I guess, that fetishize like either assisting someone in a suicide or just like suicide as a whole. This kind of actually ties into what's referred to as autoerotic asphyxiation. It is the phenomena where people, they hang themselves to restrict like oxygen and they get a sexual pleasure from it. The thing is, some people go too far with the hanging, that they don't get themselves down in time or they don't finish fast enough, and they are found by a loved one hanging on the ceiling with their pants down. This one gets joked about a lot because of the hilarious circumstances that someone would find them in that condition. That being said, there are real people that do die from this, so I figured I'd for once not joke about it. Next up, we have flaying, where you're just taking bits of skin off of a person. An offshoot off of that would be live flaying, where I guess the victim is still alive while you're flaying them, and there's some kind of sexual torture to be had from that. I just tried to imagine it, and I physically fucking, oh my god. Next up, we have the C-section. Sometimes if the baby can't come out of the birth canal, or just in general there's something that can't allow a normal birth, the baby will have to be cut out as the way it's birthed into the world. And much like the miscarriage, I guess there's people that are turned on by the process. Next up is brain fucking. I guess there's someone out there who has fucked a brain before. I do not want to go into that one. This one kind of spoke for itself. Following that, we have unbirthing and rebirthing. Unbirthing is where you go back into someone through their birth canal. And then rebirthing is them coming back out. This could tie back to egg laying in some weird capacity, because it's entering through a person's vagina, and then I need to stop trying to explain this. Next up, we have mutations. This one, I guess, would tie back to the dysmorphophilia, where you're turned on by some kind of physical defect or condition that someone has. I don't understand a lot of the things that are on this iceberg. Next up is decapitation, or the severed head, where you're turned on by a severed head. The stuff you could do to the head involving the neck hole, or other holes that probably should not be used for sexual purposes. Oh my god. And then next up we have esophagogastroduodeneoscopy. It's where you enter into someone's duodenum from their esophagus through their intestines, and then you're there. I guess this is the same thing with colonoscopies, where you're turned on by having that process done on you. I don't really know. Following that, we have decomposition, where you're turned on by the process of something decomposing over time. It could be something, I guess, like trash, or in some extreme cases like we're going to be talking about, necrophilia. After that, we have drug overdose, where you're probably turned on by someone overdosing on drugs. Next up is snake torture, which is, I can't believe I'm saying this. This is the only thing on this iceberg that actually isn't what you think it is. Snake torture is where you have a snake and you torture someone with it by having it bite them. This is no way animal abuse, or at least I hope not. It's just a very weird way of torture that I've never even thought of before. Next up is dolphin bukkake. This is more of a hypothetical than it is something that's happened. We all know dolphins are horrible sexual deviants. We've all heard the horror stories and the horrifying fun facts that are solely related to dolphins. The hypothetical is that a woman has enough dolphins that are turned on, and they do stuff to the woman. Next up is evangelization, which I wish it was, but it has nothing to do with angels. It's where you're turned on by something being turned inside out. This could tie back to the prolapse in that process, but I guess evangelization refers to specifically when you turn a penis inside out. After that, we have the miracle of childbirth. There are people out in this world who very much fetishize childbirth. In fact, we have a very fun little incident involving someone sexualizing childbirth. A woman, her partner posted their childbirth onto the internet, and she found it being sexualized by a lot of men. And it's a very fucked up story that I probably will get into on its own video, on its own time. Next up, we have abortion. There are people in this world who don't treat abortion the way it should be, as a basic human right, and like to exploit abortion as a way to get off. Next up, we have tongue removal. This one doesn't really need an explanation. You're removing someone's tongue. Next up, we have a pornophilia, where you're turned on by amputating a healthy limb. Next up, we have mummification, where you're turned on by either the process of mummification or the result of a mummification. Next up is brain eating. It's specifically cannibalism, where you eat someone's brain. Zombies, this goes back to zombies, I guess, too. And then, of course, we probably should have put it up higher on this list since I already mentioned it. We have necrophilia. Necrophilia is where you're just turned on by the dead, whether you're violating a dead body or just watching someone die. And then following necrophilia, we have the post-mortem autopsy. You're turned on by the process of tearing someone open and figuring out how they died, and just exhuming the remains from their bodies before they're put in their coffins. Next up are harlequin babies. Harlequin babies, it's a really fucked up condition that happens to infants and newborns, where They're born with really thick skin that dries up easily, and their limb movement, their joints are very restricted. Somewhat horrifyingly, you'll see the Harlequin baby with very red eyes. It's one of the more horrifying natural occurrences in human genetics. Next up is the vivisection, which I guess ties back to the post-mortem autopsy in a way. It's where you're alive and people are experimenting on you, cutting you open, all kinds of things in the name of science. I guess there's people that are turned on by that. Next up, we have the face removal, where you're turned on by someone removing your face or you removing someone else's face. And then lastly, we have eye fucking. It is the last thing that a dick should not go in. And that marks the end of Tier 6, another thing we got through pretty fast. There wasn't a lot that I had to explain, but also not a lot that I could really joke about other than just reading it to you. Tier 7 was where most of the effort went into this video. Next up, we have Tier 7. Originally named The Fallen, I've decided to rename it to The Outcasts. Before we get into this tier, I'd like to mention that the Tier 7 that we're going to be seeing in this video is not at all the original Tier 7 that was on this iceberg. I will go more into it as we go further and further into this section. There were certain things on Tiers 5 and 6 that, they didn't belong in Tiers 5 or 6. So starting off, we have the Outcasts of Tier 5. Pretty plain and simple. These are the things I felt didn't belong in Tier 5, and in fact, belonged in the lowest of the low of this iceberg. So Section 1 of this chapter is going to be talking about pedophilia in cartoons and hentai. Pretty plain and simple. It is drawn or animated children depicted in very sexual situations. You usually see this with TV show, movies, or just comic characters as a whole. But in hentai, we have two very specific names for it: the lolly and the shota. Lolly is designated to the younger girls in hentai, so of course, shota is for the younger boys. So-called lovers of this hentai are referred to as shotacons or lolicons. Some offshoots of this are what are referred to as the toddler con and the opie lolly. You already know what toddler con is going to be, plus I really don't want to explain it. Opie is like a meme in hentai, or it's a way you would describe someone with big boobs. So of course, when you pair it with a lolly, you get what I'm trying to explain here. And then an offshoot of this topic as a whole is referred to as cub. Once again, furry porn makes a return in this video. Cub is the furry equivalent to this kind of art. That being said, not all furries do this. In fact, a lot of furries denounce the creation and distribution of cub. That being said, this is still a very small minority that does exist, and sometimes they just tend to speak louder than the rest. It's here I'd like to add my own little talking point in this section by bringing up the artist known as Shadman. Shadman is a very, very infamous Twitter/Newgrounds artist who is very well known for their trap art. That being said, they are more well known for their lolly and shota art, and then the weird trap variations of that art. There is an ongoing argument regarding the morality of this kind of art. Side A argues that it's just art, people need to stop freaking out, there's no real children. It's a little problematic, but they live with their lives and they move on. It's not their whole personality. The more sheltered people tend to die on this hill by trying to justify it by bringing actual pedophilia into this conversation. And then side B argues that even if it is just art, it's still depicting something that should not be depicted. There is a reason that I'm bringing Shadman into this argument, and for that, I'd like you to imagine this as an actual fight. We have side A and side B. They're duking it out to win this argument. Shadman is in the background of all of this, doing something that neither side A nor side B ever stopped to think about. Shad began drawing art of real people, and that includes children. There are 3 specific incidents where he's done this. Now, we all know Killer Keemstar. He's the supervillain of the internet we all love to hate. Shad decided to draw art of his then 7-year-old daughter. Allow me to take you back to 2016. iDubbbz' content cop on Keemstar is made, and the real Filthy Frank is back from the dead to take down Chin Chin and his doppelganger imposter. But more importantly, 2016 is when we saw all hell break loose in America thanks to the election cycle. Before we had Sleepy Joe, we had Donald Trump singing about trucks.
Bing, bing, bong, bong.
Towards the end of the election, someone suggested to Shad that he draw art of Keemstar's daughter, giving Trump a head. Shad did him one better. He would do it if Trump won the election. And very obviously, we know who won the election that year. With Trump winning the election, Shad began to draw his magnum opus. Or so we thought. Very thankfully, someone by the name of Colossal is Crazy decided to stop and intervene. Colossal is a very close friend of Keemstar, and he pretty much confronted Shad in the middle of his live stream saying, "You just can't do this," and called him out on the sick nature of just drawing any art of a real child. Shad, of course, apologized, flubbed Colossal's ego before declaring that he would put a full stop to the Keemstar daughter art piece. Of course, he made that promise with his fingers crossed and still made art of Keemstar's daughter. While it wasn't the Donald Trump idea, he still drew some art of Keemstar's daughter, sexual or not, and in some ways, he did go back on his promise to some capacity. Around this time is when the YouTuber Lieutenant Corbus would start to become popular. Lieutenant Corbus was a commentary Leafy style channel, and the whole gimmick was that for someone as young as her content was very well spoken and very well produced at the time. So well produced, in fact, that it even inspired a 12-year-old Eros to make his own YouTube channel by reacting to racist Mario.
Okay.
Shad pretty much drew porn of her. He depicts Lieutenant Corbus pleasuring herself with her microphones. It's here I'd like to also mention that I am actually the same age as Corbus, 19, about to turn 20 next year. This means that Shad drew this art of her when we would both be around 12 years old. People don't really seem to bring as much attention when he drew Corbus. While yes, there were some moral discussions about it, it never reached the levels of like drama as it did with Keemstar and his daughter. Let me take you to about a year after all this shit happens. 2017. Early 2017. By this time, we're all really fucking hyped for the Logan movie to come out. A gory X-Men film featuring Wolverine. What can be more better than that? What more could we ask for? Well, Shad was pretty excited for this movie too, but not for Logan. Instead, he had his sights set on the character's daughter, X-23. Shad went all in on this one. He depicted X-23 being handcuffed, restrained, battered up, cut up, and being pissed on. The worst part about this is this goes even deeper than sexualizing the character. There are screenshots out there of Shad fetishizing the actress playing X-23, a then 11-year-old Daphne Keene. These screenshots were definitely something to read. I will put them up on the screen for you. Take these how you will. The main defense for Shad and his art is that it's all a joke and he's just being edgy. In the grand scheme of things, there are worse things in the world to be concerned about. But I can agree that it is a little fucking weird that there are people that are into this kind of thing. So that was the first group of outcasts from Tier 5. I really hope you guys didn't mind the lengthier explanation of things. When I go into script writing these things, I just have a point and then I improvise it when I start recording. The topics I'm going to be talking about in this tier don't exactly allow me to do that. My intention with these videos is to explain these kind of things to you, but make them easy to listen to and sometimes make you laugh in the process. But with this specific part of the video, it's now my job to make sure that I treat these topics with respect. I may crack an occasional joke or two at some points, but I in no means way to laugh in anyone's face, nor do I mean to invalidate anyone's trauma if they've been through the things I'm going to be talking about in this video. I just want to acknowledge a very fucked up part of the world that does exist. So with that being said, we move on to section 2 of the Outcasts of Tier 5. It's here where I'd like to add the first ever trigger warning. I mean, as you've seen through these past 2 videos, I've never show any of the things I'm actually talking about, nor do I ever plan on changing that. But that being said, there are certain things that, while I may be comfortable talking about them, not everyone is as fucked up as I am. So, trigger warning, I'm going to be talking about the depictions of bestiality, animal abuse, murder, and just necrophilia. If you really don't want to hear me talk about these kind of things, you can skip to this timestamp. I'm going to give you a few seconds to decide whether you want to stay here or move on to the last section of the Outcasts of Tier 5. And if you're still here, your morbid curiosity fascinates me as much as I'm fascinated by it. Let's get into this section of the Outcasts. So, this section talks about bestiality and zoophilia. Zoophilia is where you're just turned on by animals, and then bestiality is the act of having sex with animals. That being said, its inclusion in the iceberg is very broad, very vague, so I decided to include my own topics to talk about when talking about bestiality and porn. First off, we have Mr. Hands. Mr. Hands is a very infamous shock video to show up in the early 2010s or so, where our titular character named Mr. Hands is seen being mounted by a horse. The whole legend around this video also is that Mr. Hands would then go on to die from this exact horse. That's not at all the case. He does die from a horse, but not the exact horse or video we see in Mr. Hands. In fact, Mr. Hands is a really deep and very scary rabbit hole that I do plan on covering in its own video more in depth when I have the time to do research. Next up, we have Mr. Hands number 2, or the Twitter horse video. We see a man named Michael Hanley also being mounted by a horse. And of course, this being a more recent shock video thing to pop up, people are calling this thing Mr. Hands 2, given the horse involved in this video. Next up, we have the girl from Central. The girl from Central is another recent trend that kind of pops up, more specifically within the demographic of high schoolers that are returning to school. Essentially, the concept is that there is a girl from Central, and she posted a video of her being fucked by her dog. This video very obviously gets passed around school, and it should be apparently obvious that this is just a myth. There are a shit ton of schools around America that are named Central, and it's like, if anyone's gullible enough to believe it, people are going to think that it's from their Central. This actually went around my school during my sophomore year of high school, and it turned out to actually just be a middle-aged lady that got arrested for posting a video of her being fucked by her dog. The girl from Central is a really weird TikTok trend, phenomena, thing that for some reason every time it pops up, it still gives the same reaction to the newer generations as it did the last. Next up, we have crushing. Crushing is another level added to bestiality. It's where a person, usually a woman, is seen stomping on baby animals. The lady is usually seen wearing heels while she does this, and the animals involved are usually kittens. And then going off of that, we have the shock video, One Boy, Two Kittens. This is a shock video that showed up in early 2010 or so, where a hooded figure is seen petting 2 kittens before stuffing them in a bag and vacuum sealing it and killing them in the process. This hooded figure would go on to make 2 more videos. He drowns a kitten in the bathtub in the second one, and in the third one, he feeds a kitten to a python. This hooded figure's name is Luca Magnotta. If the name sounds familiar to you, that's because Magnotta would go on from killing cats to killing a person. In 2012, Luca Magnotta killed 34-year-old Jun Lin using an ice pick. He recorded the murder, proceeded to record him chopping up the body into numerous pieces, and record himself violating it. If you haven't figured it out already, I am referring to the shock video that's on the internet referred to as One Lunatic, One Ice Pick. The last part of this section is One Bitch, 9 Pups. This is a series of videos that are currently lost on the internet, and they should stay that way. 40-year-old zoologist Adam Britton recorded 10 separate videos of him murdering a litter of puppies and then violating their bodies. The last ever video of this series shows Adam Britton murdering the mother and then doing horrific things to her body as well. That was all I had written down for Group 2 of the Outcasts of Tier 5. I apologize for how heavy the conversation was if you decided to stick around and watch that section, but if you are skipping to this timestamp after my trigger warning, I'd like to say welcome back. You did miss a lot, but it's not worth going back for it if you're really squeamish to animal abuse. This one's no better. Another trigger warning here. We're going to be talking about the depictions of rape and pornography and its really gross sexualization of it. If you want to skip this conversation, here's this timestamp for you. It's going to send you straight to the Outcasts of Tier 6. I'll give you a few seconds to think about it if you want to stick around for this conversation or not. I'm going to take my hat off just for the sake of what I'm going to be talking about from this point onward. Let's get into this last section. So once again, this last group of outcasts talks about the depictions of rape in pornography. First off, we have the time stop. Time stop is a reoccurring trope in hentai where the protagonist has some kind of stopwatch or magical superpower to stop time. This gives our protagonist the chance to get revenge on a group of girls that bully him, or get the chance to experience his crush without her knowledge. Next up is religious abuse. This could be very much a power dynamic thing, where someone of a higher power in a religion is taking advantage of someone. Next up is stuck in the wall. This is another reoccurring hentai trope that does show up in real porn too, where by some weird means our female protagonist is stuck in a wall in a very compromising position. Of course, since she can't get out, that gives passerbys the opportunity to take advantage of her. And then following that, we have mental retardation. I do know that this is a very problematic word to say in the modern day. I'm going to be honest here. Personally, I'm not offended by anyone using the word. People can call me the word, but that being said, if people want me to stop using it, I will stop using it. I'm an asshole, but I'm not a monster. But going back to this topic, this is where you're just taking advantage of someone with some kind of mental disability. And then following that, we have another common hentai trope, the tentacle/monster. I'm pretty sure I mentioned monster girl and monster boy hentai in the last tier. Well, I forgot to mention that usually this shows up in the context of a monster taking advantage of numerous female protagonists. And then next up we have Ryona. This is another fucking hentai term. It is a specific genre of hentai where our female protagonist is kidnapped and tortured for the sexual pleasure of the kidnapper. And then to finally stop talking about this conversation, we have sleep molestation. It is where a woman is taken advantage of in her sleep. And that was all I had to say about this last group of outcasts from Tier 5. If you're coming from the timestamp, I'd just like to say hi once again. Now we move on to the outcasts of Tier 6. This is where things... If it wasn't fucked up already here, it's going to get a lot worse. The outcast of Tier 6 is where I'm going to add my third trigger warning, because this is going to be talking about child abuse and child exploitation in pornography. If you want to skip to this timestamp and avoid this conversation as well, you can. I think this timestamp is going to lead you straight to the original residents that were on Tier 7. This video does not end on a depressing note, spoiler alert. CP, usually people use the term cheese pizza when they talk about CP. Very obviously they use the word cheese pizza in order to not get demonetized by YouTube when talking about this kind of stuff. But of course, since I'm not making money yet, it's child pornography. CP is short for child pornography. Next up we have ephebophilia and then hebophilia. Ephebophilia is where you're turned on by someone within the age range of 15 to 19. Hebophilia is anyone under the age of 15. But the thing is, it doesn't really matter whether or not there's a distinction for what other fucking age group you like. You are still liking someone that is under the age of consent, and it is still very much pedophilia. In the words of a comedian that I can't exactly think of the name of right now, there's no real way to explain these two without sounding even more like a pedophile. Next up we have DFC, delicious flat chest. Following that we have jailbait. Jailbait is when someone under the age of consent is dressed, as some people would put it, they look mature for their age. The term itself, jailbait, refers to the promiscuity of these younger people and the fact that it's bait for you to go to jail. It is also the name of a very poorly aged Motorhead song, which is unfortunate because I really love Motorhead. Following that, we have newborns. There is an even lower level of CP where people sexualize newborn babies. Going off of that, we have omophilia, where if you don't know what there's a condition out there that affects newborn babies where their stomach and their intestines are sticking out of their stomach. And I guess the philia would mean that there are people that are turned on by it. I will say this is another one of the things that isn't an actual term on the internet, and now that I'm thinking about it this deep into the iceberg, this is probably the creator of this iceberg calling themselves out for being turned on by that kind of thing. Next up we have infanticide. Infanticide is where you're turned on by murdering your infant child. following that is baby stomping. It is a form of infanticide where you're just stomping on a baby. And then something I felt needed to be added to this section is the film Daisy's Destruction. If you're really unfamiliar with Daisy's Destruction, to summarize, it is one of the most vile things to ever be made and published to the internet. Daisy's Destruction was an hour-long video that was sold as a pay-per-view for $10,000 by the monster known as Peter Scully. Peter, his girlfriend, and I think potentially a third adult are seen torturing 2 children in this video, one of them being an 18-month infant named Daisy. There is rumor out there that there was a third victim in this video that digs her own grave and is strangled to death by Peter. It should go without saying, very obviously this is just a rumor because no one's actually seen this video. To avoid any kind of persecution, Scully escaped to the Philippines, but eventually he was hunted down and brought to justice. He was given life in prison and is deemed one of the worst sexual predators to ever walk on this earth. Hurtcore takes CP up a notch by abusing the child in the video. Daisy's Destruction very obviously is labeled as Hurtcore. The only reason I'm making this connection is because Hurtcore is actually denounced by all the pedophiles hiding around the internet. So not only did Peter Scully make the worst ever thing to be published to the internet, he made something so awful that it makes other pedophiles sick. That's all I have for the Outcast of Tier 6. This was a very, very rough thing to write and talk about for this video. But if you're coming from the trigger warning, I'd like to welcome you all to the end of this tier in this video. This iceberg tier doesn't end on such a fucked up note because this is going to be talking about the original residents of Tier 7. These were things that were on Tier 7 before I decided to completely redo it, and these were things I just felt like talking about because, once again, doing this tier really pissed me off. First up, we have Jeffrey Dahmer's zombies. Everyone knows who Jeffrey Dahmer is. He was the gay cannibal that killed a bunch of black men, and one of my people. Before he would go and cannibalize some of his victims, he would drill holes into some of their heads, and then drop things like acid or hot boiling water into the wounds. He did this in order to somehow lobotomize them in a way that they would turn into submissive zombies that would never leave him. Next up, we have concrete enemas. If you remember enemas from my last video and my horrible explanation of them, you'll know that enemas go into your rectal cavity to clean it out. There is a practice where some people will take concrete mix and use that as the enema. Very obviously, you need to go to the hospital to get that out. Next up is the elusive cock goblin. And this was the thing that made me decide to go out of my way and redo Tier 7. I would understand if the creator of this iceberg put this on here as some kind of like, hey, we're talking about some fucked up stuff. Here's a really funny thing for you to research just to lighten the mood a little bit. But the stuff I just mentioned from Tiers 5 and 6 are on Tiers 5 and 6. I don't understand how the child pornography and bestiality deserve to not be on the bottom, like, worst parts of humanity. Once again, this is a bit of a tangent. I apologize. Elusive cock goblin was the thing that really, like, frustrated me the most when doing this whole iceberg series. The elusive cock goblin is a stupid internet meme where it's like an urban legend that there's a goblin that steals your dick at night. I don't mean to sound as pissed as I do, but given how some of the things were sorted on this iceberg, it made me feel a type of way. Next up, we have the blowfly girl. My description of this topic is going to be extremely Cliff Notes because I actually want to talk about this as its own separate video. The blowfly girl refers to a story told by the girl herself where she is very turned on by trash and rubbish. In fact, she touches herself in dumpsters. This one special day, on a really hot day, I might add, she is very much into this routine. So much so that she decides that this time around she gets naked and begins to actually physically dig into this garbage that she is surrounded by. She like dips her hand into some of the garbage and begins to start pleasuring herself to the scent, and it's just like, this is the craziest she's ever felt while doing this. If you think that it couldn't get worse from here, this chick proceeds to take rotten meat from this trash, and I'd like to also add that it's maggot infested. As harmless as maggots are, and as cool as they are, she begins to stick these rotten, maggot-infested pieces of meat and put it in her. And she's just like touching herself all over with these infected hands and stuff. And needless to say, this whole story ends with her being in the hospital. Whether or not the validity of this story is legit, I horribly covered it. This is like the most summarized I could be to like without like wasting your time through this video. Once again, I am going to be talking about this video on its own pretty soon. Next up is One Guy, One Jar. I did mention that this was something I was going to mention on its own in the last two tiers. That was before I realized it was on this tier originally. One Guy, One Jar is a video of a man sticking a jar up his ass. And, of course, this jar shatters. And he has to pull out the pieces. And he's doing so he's not whining in pain. And it's amazing how much he's enduring all of that. And then lastly, we have the Rainbow Dash Cum Jar. A 4chan user, I believe, stuck a Rainbow Dash doll into a jar full of cum, left it on his heater for, I think, a few months or years, and this jar it boiled alive, essentially, in the jar. It's actually kind of funny to think about. I would cover this video if Wang didn't cover it as well. I don't really want to steal Wang's ideas here. These were all the residents of Tier 7 that I actually bothered to care about talking about. Doing these 3 tiers as a whole made me mad because of the way it was formatted. But an honorable mention I'd like to make is 2 Girls, 1 Cup. 2 Girls, 1 Cup is a scat video on the internet. Everyone knows this video. It is a short clip of girls eating their shit. And it's accompanied by the song that I know how to play on the piano. Obviously, if you don't know already, 2 Girls, 1 Cup is actually just the trailer for an even longer scat-related film known as Hungry Bitches. It's so funny saying that, Hungry Bitches. And with that, we have finally reached the end of this video. Before all of you click off, please stay. I'd like to add one final message before I send you all on your way. The next part of this series won't be as depressing as this one. In fact, I can thankfully end things on a bit of a goofy note. But all that being said, this next part is going to be the last, and we are going to be finished with this iceberg as a whole. If you couldn't tell already, I love watching these style of videos a lot. In fact, I'm pretty much a kid that was raised by YouTube and internet culture as a whole. Now that I'm both over 18 and developed pretty moderate video editing abilities, I can finally make content that I personally would like to watch on my own time. And I would like to pass down that sentiment to you guys. They don't necessarily have to be iceberg related, but they can be. I really don't mind this style of video. I'll take any suggestions, I'll take anything talking about the goofy parts of the internet to the other fucked up parts of the world I didn't get to talk about with this iceberg. Hell, if there are things in this iceberg you want to see me go more in depth on, I honestly wouldn't say no. All that being said, I'd like to thank you all and even congratulate you for making it to the end of the video. Although I hope it's not the case, I'm gonna assume that it was just as hard for you guys to get through this video as much as it was for me. Once again, just give me suggestions, because once we move on to Tier 4, we're gonna be done with this series. So until then, I guess I'll see you guys around.